It's time for our first aside. Throughout this course, we'll have lectures that are asides. That means that we're going to cover something that's just off to the side of what we're talking about directly, but very, very important to understand whatever technique or concept or aspect of JavaScript that we're about to cover. Now, each aside might have a particular type. In this case, we're going to do a conceptual aside. A conceptual aside means we'll focus on a concept or an idea that's fundamental to the rest of the course of understanding and building slowly our knowledge of JavaScript, which is what we're going to do. This conceptual aside will cover 3 ideas: syntax parsers, execution contexts, and lexical environments. These are fundamental concepts, fundamental ideas to understanding the rest of what we're going to talk about, and you're going to see these ideas come up again and again throughout the rest of this course. Now, all 3 of these are complicated sounding terms that actually aren't that difficult to understand. So we're going to give you your first 3 big word alerts in a row. All right, so here's our first one. Big word alert. Syntax parser. Break glass. A program that reads your code and determines what it does and if its grammar or syntax is valid. So when you write JavaScript, it isn't magically directly telling the computer what to do. You're abstracted away from all of that. You're writing code, but then someone else or other people built programs that convert your JavaScript into something the computer can understand. Those programs are called compilers, and at times they also have to do with interpreters. But those programs, interpreters and compilers, do the process, the work of actually reading your code character by character and determining if the syntax is valid and then implementing that syntax in a way the computer can understand. So when you're thinking about your code, think of it more like this. You have your code that you've written, and there's a program that is going to convert what you've written into a real set of computer instructions, something the hardware can physically understand. So if you have a function with a variable, that function and variable will be represented in memory, but it's being translated from what you're writing, what is more human readable, to what the computer can understand. There's a compiler or an interpreter between those 2 things, and part of that is a syntax parser. So it's going through character by character, like F-U-N-C-T-I-O-N, and says, oh, that's function, so there should be a space after this. And then the next thing I see up until the parenthesis will be the name of the function, etc., etc. And that gets translated by the systems that someone else wrote. But that also means that in that translation process, if they so choose, the programmers that wrote the compiler can choose to do extra stuff. Your code is not what's actually being given to the computer, but a translation of it. And so along the way, the engine that is interpreting your code can decide to do other things. Those programmers, those guys and girls, could have chosen to do something else. And in fact, that's going to come up as an important element of understanding JavaScript. So that's syntax parsers and thinking about the programs that are actually running every time you run your JavaScript code, that intermediate program that's creating your code. And we're going to see this come up later on. All right, time for the second one. So, big word alert. What's the next big word we're going to cover? Lexical environment. That's a big term. Where something sits physically in the code you write. The word lexical means having to do with words or grammar. So we're talking about the code you're writing, its syntax, its vocabulary. Now, a lexical environment exists in programming languages in which where you write something is important. So that sounds kind of funny, but actually, not every programming language is that way. But remember, we said you might have some code, let's say a function, with a variable inside of it. The variable sits lexically inside the function. That is, physically the code that you're writing, that's where it sits. But remember, we said that your code is not what's actually given directly to the computer, but it's translated into something the computer can understand. But in programming languages where the lexical environment is important, that means that where you see things written gives you an idea of where it will actually sit in the computer's memory, of how it will interact with other variables and functions and elements of the program. And that's because the program, the compiler that's converting your code to those instructions, cares about where you put things. It makes decisions. That syntax parser going through everything makes decisions. So when we talk about the lexical environment of something in the code, we're talking about where it's written and what surrounds it. Got that? All right, let's move on to the third one. Our last big word alert. What is it? Execution context. A wrapper to help manage the code that is running. There are lots of lexical environments, areas of the code that you're looking at physically, but which one is currently actually running is managed via what's called execution context. And an execution context contains your code, the running code, it's running your code, but it also can contain things beyond what you've written in your code. Because remember, again, your code is being translated, being processed by a whole other feature, a whole other set of programs that someone else wrote. And so it's executing your code, and it can do other things as well, and that's what's happening inside JavaScript. We'll see that very shortly. So, lexical environments, we're talking about execution context, we're talking about syntax parsers. Just remember, it's important. We're going to hear these terms and understand them throughout the course, and it will give us a basis to understand what's happening under the hood in JavaScript. All right, let's move on.